The morning started like any other. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden hue over the quiet suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass and morning dew. Birds chirped lazily in the distance, and the world seemed peaceful. But as I stepped outside, I felt it, a gnawing sense that something was off. It was one of those gut instincts that you can't ignore, the kind that nags at you until you figure out why. I scanned the driveway, and my heart sank. My ATV, my pride and joy, a custom-painted off-road beast that I had spent countless hours and dollars perfecting, was gone. The empty spot where it had been parked the night before stared back at me like a gaping wound. My stomach dropped so fast I nearly got whiplash. This had to be a joke, right? Maybe my buddy, Mark, had moved it as a prank. But Mark wasn't the type to pull something like this. He was more of a dad joke kind of guy, not a steal your ATV kind of guy. No, this was something worse. Something far, far worse. A distant rumble snapped me out of my thoughts. At first, it was just a faint sound carried by the wind, but then it grew louder, tires crunching over gravel, an engine revving. An engine I knew like the back of my hand. My head whipped around, and there she was, coming down the street like she owned the whole damn neighborhood. Margaret, riding my ATV with a smug grin plastered across her face. Margaret was the self-proclaimed queen of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, HOA. Middle-aged, with a penchant for floral blouses and an air of entitlement that could rival a monarch, she was notorious for her borrowing habits. Except, in Margaret's world, borrowing didn't involve asking. She had a history of swiping things, lawn chairs, ladders, even a cooler full of beer once. But this was on another level. She pulled up right in front of me, the ATV's tires skidding slightly as she came to a stop. "Oh, good morning, Alex," she chirped, as if she were out on a casual Sunday stroll. "I just took it for a quick little ride. Hope you don't mind." I blinked at her, struggling to comprehend the sheer audacity. "Are you serious?" I managed to say, barely keeping my voice steady. "You just took it?" Margaret waved a dismissive hand, as if I were the unreasonable one. "Oh, don't be dramatic. It was just a little ride. I needed to get to the community center in a hurry, and I thought, well, Alex won't mind." I stared at her, my brain short-circuiting. Not mind. She had the nerve to sit there, perched on my ATV like she had just test-driven a car from a dealership and was waiting for my approval. "You stole my ATV," I said slowly, enunciating every word so there was no possible room for confusion. Margaret scoffed. "Stole? Oh, please. I was going to return it." I pointed at the mud splattered across the tires, the new scratches on the paint, the dent on the fender that definitely wasn't there yesterday. "Yeah, and what about all of this? You trashed it." She glanced down, as if noticing the damage for the first time, then shrugged. "Oops." I felt my eye twitch. This woman had the self-awareness of a traffic cone. "You're paying for the damage," I snapped, feeling my patience hanging by a single, fraying thread. Margaret let out a breathy laugh. "Oh, Alex, don't be ridiculous. It's just a little dirt. You're acting like I totaled it. Besides, you should be thanking me. I saved you gas. That did it." I could handle annoying neighbors, passive-aggressive HOA notices, even the occasional stolen lawn ornament. But this blatant disregard, this casual entitlement, was too much. I pulled out my phone. "All right then. I guess I'll just call the cops." For the first time, Margaret's smile wavered. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she huffed. "I said I was going to bring it back. There's no need to get the police involved. We're neighbors." "Exactly," I said. "Neighbors don't steal from each other." Her expression hardened. "Alex, this is absurd. Do you really want to waste their time over this?" I tapped my phone screen. Yeah, I do." As the dial tone rang, Margaret's confidence cracked. "Wait, let's talk about this," she said quickly. "Maybe I can bake you something. A pie, perhaps? You like apple." I turned away, already speaking into the receiver. "Yeah. Hi. I'd like to report a stolen vehicle." Margaret let out an exaggerated gasp. "Stolen? Oh, don't you dare use that word." I ignored her. "Yes, it's an ATV. I have video footage of it being in my driveway last night, and now it's been taken without my permission." I glanced at Margaret, whose face was turning redder by the second. "The person who took it is standing right in front of me." Margaret threw her arms up. This is ridiculous. I borrowed it, Alex. Tell them I borrowed it. I looked her dead in the eye. She stole it. If steam could come out of her ears, I swear it would have. By the time the police arrived, Margaret had gone through at least 5 different excuses to justify why she had my ATV. First, she claimed I had offered it to her. Then, when that failed, she insisted it was just a misunderstanding. When that didn't work, she tried playing the victim. I didn't know Alex was so selfish, she sniffled to the officers. I mean, honestly, this is how he treats his neighbors? Like criminals. Officer Ramirez, an older guy who had definitely dealt with his fair share of HOA nonsense, sighed. Ma'am, did you have permission to take the vehicle? Margaret crossed her arms. I had implied permission. That's not a thing, Officer Davis muttered. Well, I was going to return it. That's still not how permission works, Ramirez said dryly. The officers turned to me. You said you have video proof? I nodded and pulled up my security camera footage. The grainy video showed exactly what I expected. My ATV parked securely in my driveway at midnight, and then at 7 a.m., Margaret waddling up to it, looking around, and just hopping on and driving off like it was her personal toy. Ramirez watched the clip and exhaled slowly. Yeah, that's theft. Margaret's mouth fell open. Oh, come on. You're looking at unauthorized use of a vehicle, Davis said, pulling out his notepad. That's a chargeable offense. You can't be serious. Margaret protested. Oh, we are, Ramirez said. And we'll need to take you down to the station for questioning. The second he reached for his handcuffs, Margaret lost it. You can't do this to me, she screeched, backing away. I'm the HOA vice president. This is harassment. Ramirez gave her a tired look. Ma'am, HOA status doesn't put you above the law. Margaret turned to me, furious. Alex, fix this. I folded my arms. I'm good, actually. As the officers led her toward the squad car, she continued screaming about how this wasn't fair and how she was too respectable to be arrested. The best part? The entire neighborhood had gathered to watch. People peeked out from their porches, some even filming. The HOA president, Mrs. Thompson, stood on her lawn with a cup of coffee, shaking her head. And just like that, Margaret, the self-proclaimed queen of the cul-de-sac, was hauled away in the back of a police car, still insisting she had done nothing wrong. I watched her go, then turned back to my poor, abused ATV. I ran a hand over the scratched paint and sighed. Well, I muttered to myself, at least now I've got one hell of a story. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the houses, casting an eerie glow over the quiet neighborhood. A small crowd had gathered, neighbors whispering and pointing as Margaret stood beside the police cruiser, arms crossed tightly over her chest. The officers weren't rushing. They were taking their time, asking questions, writing things down, letting her stew in the weight of what she had done. But Margaret, true to form, wasn't the least bit remorseful. Instead, she looked downright insulted, like she was the victim here. So, just to confirm, Officer Ramirez said, tapping his pen against his notepad, "You're saying Alex gave you permission to take the ATV?" Margaret exhaled sharply through her nose. Not in so many words, but it was implied. Ramirez exchanged a glance with Officer Davis, who shook his head slightly. Ma'am, permission has to be clear and direct. Taking a vehicle without it is considered unauthorized use. Margaret scoffed, flipping her graying hair over her shoulder. Oh, please. I was going to bring it back. It's not like I sold it on the black market. Officer Davis clicked his pen and wrote something down. That doesn't change the fact that you took it without permission. And from what we can see, there's damage. Margaret waved a hand dismissively. A few little scratches. Alex is making a huge deal out of this. It's just an ATV. If anything, he should be the one in trouble for wasting your time. I crossed my arms and let out a sharp laugh. You're unbelievable, you know that? You act like my things are community property. Who does that? Margaret turned toward me with an exaggerated sigh, like I was some child throwing a tantrum over a toy. Oh, Alex, don't be so dramatic. It's just an ATV. Then why didn't you ask before taking it? I shot back. Her expression tightened for a brief second before she forced another smile. Because I knew you'd say no. Ramirez let out a low chuckle and shut his notepad. Well, that's about the clearest admission of guilt I've heard all week. Margaret's face twisted in disbelief. Oh, come on. You're really going to arrest me over this? "We're not arresting you yet," Davis said, though he didn't sound particularly sympathetic. "But we are going to need you to come down to the station for questioning." The moment he reached for his handcuffs, Margaret backpedaled so fast she nearly tripped over her own feet. Wait. This is ridiculous. I have rights. I am the vice president of this HOA. You think you can just treat me like some common criminal?" Officer Ramirez rubbed his temples, like he'd heard this speech 1,000 times before. "Ma'am, unauthorized use of a vehicle is a crime." Margaret's eyes darted toward the small group of onlookers, looking for sympathy, but none came. The HOA president, Mrs. Thompson, stood on her porch, sipping coffee and watching the scene unfold with thinly veiled amusement. A few of the other residents were holding their phones up, recording the moment for posterity. "You people are going to regret this," Margaret huffed, glaring at me like I had just ruined her entire life. "This is harassment, retaliation, abuse of power." I raised an eyebrow. "Pretty sure you took my ATV without permission." Margaret was still fuming when the officers gently guided her into the back of the police car. She kept shouting about how she was being mistreated, how she'd be calling her lawyer, how she was too important to be treated like this. The second the door slammed shut, the street fell into an eerie silence. Mrs. Thompson took a long sip of her coffee. "Well," she mused, "I can't say I'm surprised. The way she's been running around, acting like the queen of this neighborhood, it was only a matter of time before someone pushed back." I exhaled slowly, the tension in my shoulders starting to loosen as the police car finally drove away. I had no idea what would happen next. Maybe she'd be fined. Maybe they'd slap her with community service. Or maybe she'd get a slap on the wrist and be back in the neighborhood by dinner. Either way, I wasn't letting this go. The next morning, I woke up to find an HOA violation notice taped to my front door. My stomach sank the moment I saw the envelope. It didn't even take a genius to guess who was behind this. Margaret might have been carted off by the cops, but she still had her claws in the HOA. I tore the envelope open and skimmed through the letter. It was a fine, not for the ATV, not for anything related to the incident, but for improperly storing recreational vehicles on my property. I barked out a laugh. "Oh, come on." Margaret was already on the warpath, using the HOA as her personal revenge machine. I crumpled the letter in my fist. If she thought this was going to make me back down, she had another thing coming. The next few days were a whirlwind of petty fines and increasingly ridiculous HOA notices. One claimed my grass was too green. Another accused me of having an unauthorized shade of blue on my mailbox. It was laughable, except for the fact that these fines weren't small. Margaret was using every tool at her disposal to make my life miserable. The problem was, I knew fighting the HOA directly would be like punching a brick wall. I needed another way to get back at her. That's when I did a little research of my own. A few hours and several cups of coffee later, I found exactly what I was looking for. Margaret wasn't as untouchable as she thought. She had a history of complaints against her, way more than I expected. Several residents had filed grievances about her misusing HOA funds, issuing fines without board approval, and even failing to pay her own dues on time. I leaned back in my chair, grinning. "Oh, Margaret," I murmured. "You really shouldn't have messed with me." Armed with this new information, I knew exactly what I had to do. It was time to take the fight to the HOA. The HOA meeting was more crowded than usual, and I knew exactly why. Word had spread fast about Margaret's little stunt with my ATV and the police involvement that followed. People whispered in hushed voices, exchanging glances as I walked in and took a seat near the front. At the head of the room, Mrs. Thompson sat calmly, sipping her ever-present coffee. Beside her sat the rest of the HOA board, looking far less composed. And then, of course, there was Margaret, sitting stiffly in her chair with her arms crossed so tightly over her chest that it looked like she was trying to hold herself together. She was back from the police station, and judging by the sour look on her face, she was on a mission to make me regret ever reporting her. I leaned back in my chair, waiting for the inevitable. It didn't take long. The moment the meeting officially started, Margaret wasted no time launching into her tirade. "I'd like to bring up an extremely concerning issue," she said, her voice dripping with manufactured outrage. "It has come to my attention that certain residents, are bringing unnecessary drama into our peaceful community by making frivolous police reports against their own neighbors. The way she said it, you'd think I had called in a SWAT team on her for picking a flower from my yard. I didn't say anything, just watched as she huffed and puffed, her face getting redder by the second. This kind of behavior, she continued, shooting daggers in my direction, is not only disruptive but also harmful to the friendly environment we work so hard to maintain in this community. Mrs. Thompson raised an eyebrow. Margaret, are you referring to your recent police incident? Margaret's mouth opened and closed for a second before she composed herself. I was unjustly accused of theft when, in reality, I was simply borrowing a vehicle out of necessity. Mrs. Thompson took a long sip of her coffee, then set the cup down with a quiet clink. Margaret, I saw the video footage. You took Alex's ATV without permission. That is, by definition, theft. Margaret looked like she had swallowed a lemon. That's not the point. The point is, Alex's actions have created unnecessary tension, and now, thanks to his complete lack of neighborly spirit, I have had to step in to ensure that he is following the rules. Right on cue, she pulled out a stack of papers and slammed them onto the table. My stomach clenched. I already knew what this was, her list of ridiculous HOA violations. She slid them across the table with an air of triumph. Alex has been in repeated violation of HOA regulations, she announced. His grass is too long. His mailbox is not within the HOA's approved color scheme. He has left his garbage bins out for more than 6 hours after collection. And worst of all, he has improperly stored recreational vehicles on his property. I could feel every set of eyes in the room turning to me, some amused, some exasperated. Mrs. Thompson picked up the papers and skimmed them, her expression unreadable. Then she slowly looked up at Margaret. Margaret, she said, her voice carefully neutral. Are you seriously trying to fine Alex for having green grass? Margaret lifted her chin. It is too green. It stands out from the rest of the neighborhood. It disrupts the uniform aesthetic. There was a beat of silence. Then someone coughed. Someone else stifled a laugh. And just like that, the room erupted into murmurs, chuckles, and outright laughter. Even Mrs. Thompson, usually the picture of HOA professionalism, let out a small, incredulous laugh. Margaret's face turned an alarming shade of purple. This isn't funny. Mrs. Thompson cleared her throat, managing to suppress her amusement. No, Margaret, it's ridiculous. And while we're on the topic of rule enforcement, I think it's only fair that we discuss your violations. Margaret blinked, caught off guard. My what? I haven't violated anything. I leaned forward, my heart pounding with anticipation. This was the moment I had been waiting for. Actually, I said, keeping my tone casual, I did some research. And it turns out, you have a long history of complaints filed against you. Multiple residents have accused you of harassment, of issuing unapproved fines, and of misusing HOA funds for personal expenses. Gasps rippled through the room. Margaret paled. That's a lie. I pulled out my own stack of papers, printouts of public records, past HOA meeting notes, and emails from disgruntled neighbors. I slid them across the table, just as she had done to me. It's all documented, I said. And here's the best part. You're behind on your own HOA dues. Silence fell. The room collectively turned to Margaret, whose mouth was now hanging open. Mrs. Thompson exhaled, pinching the bridge of her nose. Margaret, is this true? Margaret sputtered. It's a misunderstanding. Mrs. Thompson shook her head. No, it's not. I've had my suspicions for a while, but now that Alex has provided proof, it's clear you've been abusing your position. Margaret shot up from her chair. You can't talk to me like this. I'm the vice president of the HOA. Mrs. Thompson calmly shuffled the papers in front of her. Not anymore. Margaret froze. What? We'll be holding an emergency vote. Mrs. Thompson continued. Effective immediately, we're removing you from your position on the HOA board. The room buzzed with whispered conversations. Margaret looked around wildly, her face twisting with rage. But there was no support. Her allies had abandoned her. No one was willing to stick their necks out for her after everything she had done. This isn't fair, she hissed. You can't just kick me out. Mrs. Thompson shrugged. Actually, we can. It's in the bylaws. Margaret's eyes darted to me, filled with hatred. You did this, she spat. I smiled. Yeah, I did. Security escorted Margaret out of the meeting. She went kicking and screaming, shouting about how she would sue us all, how we would regret this, how she would get revenge. But in the end, it didn't matter. She was gone. The next few weeks were blissfully peaceful. No ridiculous fines, no passive-aggressive letters, no entitled neighbor treating the entire street like her personal kingdom. And the best part? My ATV was back in my garage, fully repaired, thanks to a legal settlement that forced Margaret to cover the damages. Just when I thought it was all over, I got a letter in the mail. A lawsuit. Margaret was suing me for emotional distress. I took the letter, walked over to my garage, and pulled up my ATV's tracking data. I grinned as I saw the logs, concrete proof that Margaret had driven it onto private property and broken multiple laws in the process. The next time we saw each other was in court. The judge took one look at the evidence, let out an exasperated sigh, and threw her lawsuit out immediately. Margaret stormed out of the courtroom, defeated. And as I walked away, finally free from her nonsense, I couldn't help but laugh. Justice had never felt so sweet. Margaret moved out of Willow Creek shortly after the lawsuit was dismissed. Rumor had it she relocated to a small town where she could start fresh, though I doubted she'd ever change her ways. As for me, I continued to enjoy the peace and quiet of my neighborhood, knowing that I had stood up to the queen of the cul-de-sac and won. The HOA, now under new leadership, became more reasonable and less authoritarian. Mrs. Thompson even thanked me for exposing Margaret's abuses, and the neighborhood as a whole seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. As for my ATV, it remained safely in my garage, a symbol of my victory over petty tyranny. And every time I rode it, I couldn't help but smile, knowing that I had taken a stand and come out on top. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.